Okay, I think we can go ahead and get going. Welcome everybody to this Innovation and Adaptation speaker event with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. We are going to be talking about how we can operationalize managed relocation today. This is a quick overview of our agenda. Um, we are going to have Jessica Hellman kick us off with an introduction and kind of a little grounding in what we're going to be talking about today. We've got three expert presenters who will be introduced in just a few minutes. And then we're going to have a lot of time in group discussion among our presenters. Lots of you shared questions when you registered to attend, and so we've incorporated those into that discussion. But if new things come up for you, please feel free to put questions and comments in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to incorporate those into discussion. Again, we are recording this. Please keep yourselves muted and off camera if you're not a presenter during their portions of the event until we get to discussion time at the end. If you're new to the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, this is just a quick overview of who we are and what we do. So we're a partnership between the USGS and a consortium of research institutions across the region, hosted by the University of Minnesota, which is where I am based. And we have a mission to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. I think with that, I'm going to hand things over to Jessica to move us along.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see all these boxes and names and folks that I recognize and many that I do not. I think you're in for a real treat today. I'm expecting today's presentations and conversation to be very interesting and innovative. So I'm Jessica Hellman. I'm the Consortium Director of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center here at the University of Minnesota. As Jess Del Fiacco just described, I'm really happy to be moderating and facilitating this conversation on operationalizing managed relocation. Jess just explained our mission at the Midwest CASC, delivering science that helps fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. And one of the ways that we do that is by bringing researchers and practitioners together, because many of the hardest questions in adaptation sit right at the interface of science and decision making. So we're pursuing science in the Science Center, but we're also thinking about how do we put that science into practice? And how does practice tell us what science we need to be doing? So why this topic right now? Climate change is moving faster than many ecological systems, and frankly, faster than our institutions are able to respond. And this creates a particular challenge for adaptation. We need to make adjustments, but the pace of that adjustment is fast. So we don't just need incremental improvements in what we already do. We need ideas that are fundamentally different. And that makes, actually, just if you go back one slide for me, I can stay, that notion of not just incremental improvements, but fundamentally different ideas is this notion of innovation. And we have, as just explained, built an entire series around notions of innovation and adaptation. And here we are as part of this series. Today, next slide, Jess, we're going to focus on managed relocation because it is one of those innovative ideas. Managed relocation is one of very few strategies that is truly adaptation specific. It is an idea that exists, and the potential practice of it exists only because climate change is reshaping the basic conditions that organisms and species depend upon. So a few years ago, I had the pleasure of working with Bruce Stein and some other colleagues to develop a report on innovation and climate adaptation. And we used managed relocation as an extensive case study. A lot of my own work actually has focused on how we make adaptation decisions under uncertainty. And managed relocation is a particularly useful lens for thinking about those decisions under uncertainty, because it is all about ecological complexity. It's about risk. It's about the need to act despite incomplete innovation. It's about pursuing science in a domain that we haven't done it before. And if you go to the next slide, Jess, oh, sorry, back one more. Thank you. Um, that innovation report, which you can find online, we actually describe an innovation life cycle. And that life cycle moves from the bullet points that are shown on this slide, from problem exploration and ideation to screening and conceptual refinement, then to implementation, and eventually to diffusion and adoption. That's true in all innovations, not just in adaptation, but it also can be true in the space that we live and work in. So if you look at managed relocation through this lens of something from an idea through refinement, implementation, and maybe through adoption, diffusion, and adoption, I think it's fair to say that we probably lie somewhere in the refinement to early implementation, which we have another way of showing that on the next slide, which is in the beginning, there are early innovators involved in something, then early adopters, and more people participate as an innovation concept spreads. So we're probably still in this early adopter phase, probably not the early majority, but this is not an entirely new idea. In this early adoption stage, there are a bunch of tricky, hard things that start to appear. A lot of real world constraints emerge. This is not just a concept anymore. It's starting to be thought of in practice. So those real world constraints, things like what are we most uncertain about and how does that conform to risk or opportunity? What are the particular institutional barriers that need to be overcome for us even to consider adoption? How does the public feel about this? This is not something that is just occurring behind agency doors or in the scientific literature. And then despite all of those barriers or variation in public perception, we need to make decisions anyway and find ways to move forward. So those are some of the things that I know are going to come up today. Before we go further, next slide, Jess, please. I want to talk about what actually is managed relocation so that we all can be on the same page. When we talk about managed relocation, we are talking about the intentional movement by people of species or populations to locations where their future probability of persistence is high, and where those species or those genes have not occurred before. So we are putting things in new places because we think that's where they are likely to flourish in the future. Whether we want them to flourish for purposes of, say, endangered species conservation, or we want them to flourish for some ecosystem good or service, we are deciding and we are moving. Sometimes you hear managed relocation called assisted migration or assisted colonization. Those are kind of synonyms for our purposes here today. And I also want to flag that for our purposes, this intentional movement, this managed relocation can include things like shifting seed zones or moving genotypes, as well as relocating entire species. So it's just new things in new places, whether within a species or the species as a whole. So today's conversation is going to be about how do we take this notion of managed relocation, which ultimately was an innovative concept, and begin to move it into practice. Specifically, what does it mean to operationalize this motivation? So to explore that, I am thrilled to be joined by three colleagues who bring complementary perspectives and all have been working in this area. Each of them is going to give a short presentation, and then we're going to discuss among the four of us. So first, our first presenter will be Josh Lawler, professor at the University of Washington. Josh works on climate-driven range shifts climate-driven shifts in general, both in distributions and the implications of those shifts for conservation and conservation management. Aviv Piraso-Olsen is the Climate Adaptation Coordinator for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And Aviv works at that intersection of adaptation, conservation, and management. And Robert Fisher, conservation biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey's Western Ecological Research Center. And Robert focuses on how species and ecosystems respond to environmental change. So next slide, Jess. I would like for you all to think a few things as you are listening to our presenters and we come back around to discussion. The big question is, what do we need to move managed relocation forward? So a couple of sort of things to put in your head. I'm thinking like, what does it take to make a defensible decision about managed relocation? What science or information is needed? How do we know when it's time to act? And what are the barriers, not just ecological, but also institutional and social that we need to address? And what is the role of science in helping to address those barriers? So we'll come back to those questions. We have incorporated your questions submitted earlier into our Q&A, but if you have additional questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will address them best I can when we get to the moderating part of this presentation. And without further ado, Josh Lawler, I would like to turn the floor to you.
All right, thank you, Jessica. Let's see, I'm gonna share this
Hey,
with.
Nina, Nina, what the hell? You're fine. Everything's fine. Why are you barking? Nothing's wrong.
Everything's fine. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just spend maybe 10 minutes telling you a little bit about how I came to think the way I do about managed relocation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I did with several other people, developing a tool to prioritize species for managed relocation. So I'm going to go through that. And as Jessica mentioned when she introduced me, I've done some work looking at how species might move in response to climate change. And I got to that because maybe 25 years ago or so, I was doing research on conservation planning, trying to figure out where one might conserve or protect in order to preserve biodiversity into the future. And about the same time, I realized that climate change was going to move species around. Everybody else that was working on conservation planning did as well. And so we all realized that all these plans and algorithms we were working on might need to be thrown out the window. And we better start understanding how species were going to move so that we could plan not for where they are today, but where they might need to be in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So I started looking at how one models how species might move around, and I did a bunch of that. And at some point, there was a student in my lab, Carrie Schloss, who now works for the Nature Conservancy, who said, well, we've got all these ideas of how species might move, but can they really get there? Can they move that far? Can they move that fast? Are species going to be able to keep up with a changing climate? And she did a bunch of work and looked at 500 different mammal species in North and South America and came to the conclusion that in some places, up to 40% of the mammals might not be able to keep pace with climate change. And mammals are pretty mobile compared to some other organisms. And so we were also hearing other studies at that time about species not being able to keep pace with climate change. So my lab group kind of shifted what we were doing a bit, and we spent a lot of the last 15 years or so looking at several adaptation approaches, one being improving connectivity to allow species to move where they might need to go in response to climate change. The map on the left just shows potential passages from areas that are slightly warmer to areas that are slightly cooler that might allow organisms to avoid humans, to avoid steep climate gradients, and to get where they might need to go as the climate changes. And we did a bunch of work looking at connectivity. And then the map on the right shows potential climatic refugia. And we spent a bit of the last 10, 15 years looking at how one might define climatic refugia. And these might be places where organisms don't have to move to address climate change, or places they might move to that might remain suitable for them in a changing climate. So we spent a lot of our time going down these two tracks, and I tried pretty hard for a while to avoid the whole what was then assisted colonization or assisted migration debate, because there was a debate. People had started moving things around. Uh, the Torreya in the southeastern U.S. People were moving it around, and that fueled actions like that fueled this debate among conservation biologists about whether we really should be moving species around and what it would mean to be moving them around ourselves. And I tried to stay out of that. I didn't succeed. I ended up writing a couple papers, but in reading all that and being immersed in people discussing it, I came to the conclusion that um, the climate was changing and was likely to change enough that we probably did want to have this tool in our toolbox. And maybe we didn't want to use it all the time, but we wanted to use it sparingly. We wanted to understand how to use it, but we probably needed to have it in the toolbox. And so that's the conclusion I came to. What is that? Maybe 15 to 20 years ago when this debate was sort of raging. Uh, and then we'll fast forward to 2 years ago, when the Midwest Cask, Jessica, a number of people that are on this call, I noticed. I saw Brian and Olivia. We're at a meeting that the Midwest Cask organized to talk about managed relocation and to see where we are and kind of check in. And what was really interesting to me was that there were many agencies and other organizations moving species around. Like managed relocation has been happening over the last 10 years or so. Species are being moved, best practices are being developed. The need for moving species is becoming more apparent. And so there was a lot going on that we learned about in this meeting, and there was a lot we learned about what we still need to know. And so there was one group came out of that meeting, this group of people I've got listed on this slide, who decided that one thing we might need is a way to prioritize all the species that might need to be moved so that we can get down to a smaller list and really consider those carefully. And so you notice that this has folks from Park Service and USGS and USDA and other organizations. And we set out to determine whether we could create a tool, a scorecard of sorts, to prioritize species for managed relocation. And if you think of the managed relocation process, you could summarize it in a handful of steps, which is what this little diagram shows. The first step might be taking a whole lot of species and figuring out which ones you really want to consider. Then you might need to screen those species really carefully to say, should we move these? Because maybe there'd be a risk to the receiving ecosystem. Maybe they'd impact the human community. Then after you go through that screening, you might need to do some planning and some preparation, then move the species around. Then after that, you've got to monitor and assess how well it worked. And you could add other steps in that process. But we were really focused on that first big yellow box at the top, right? How do you go from having 50, 60 species you're considering to having a smaller number that you can really focus on and do whatever research you need to do to determine how feasible it is? So what we came up with was a scorecard that had two parts. And the first part was a set of 4 simple questions that determine whether you're going to proceed to the second part. And so if you couldn't answer these 4 questions in the affirmative, then you just dropped the species and you weren't even going to prioritize it any further. So these are things like, is the species vulnerable to climate change? Some of these are fairly obvious. Can you manage it in place? Is adaptation in situ realistic or feasible? Does at least one potential site exist to put the species? If there's nowhere to put it, if there's no alternative place, then you don't need to proceed. Are key species upon which the species you're considering depends present at these places you might put it? Or could you move them along with the species? And if you couldn't, or if they're not present and you can't move them, well, then maybe you don't consider the species any further. So after going through this step, we came up with 15 questions that one could ask to further prioritize the species that made it through that first filter. And those 15 questions fell under the topics of what are the climate impacts likely to the species? How necessary is it to move the species? How appropriate is it to move the species? What is the risk to the species of moving it? And how feasible is it to do it? And you notice that some of these, the impact, the appropriateness, the risk, you could think of those as applying to the ecosystem, the place where you put the species, right? The receiving ecosystem. But we weren't considering that at all. This is only focused on the species itself. So we came up with this scorecard and then we tested it out. We took a handful of Pacific Island birds and we fed them through the process. And these are the results for 3 of those species. The columns here represent the first ones that first stage of deciding whether you're going to proceed or not, those simple 4 questions. And then the other 15 questions feed into those 5 other columns. And then there's a total on the far right. And you'll see one of these 3 species, we didn't answer those first 4 questions in the affirmative. And so we gave it a no. So technically, we wouldn't have gone on and done the other 15 questions, but we did anyway, just as an illustration of how it works. And then the other thing you'll note is that in that far right column, one of these species, the Laysan finch, got a 29, and the Kikiki, which I might be pronouncing wrong, got a 17. And so we found that going through these species we looked at, we could prioritize them using this tool. So at least as a proof of concept, it seemed to work. So coming out of that exercise, I can draw several conclusions. First is that there are a lot of Pacific Island birds in particular, but probably a lot of Pacific Island species that may need to be moved in response to climate change. And so we may need tools like this and the larger tool like managed relocation to move them around. And perhaps even more so, because the climate is still changing and humans aren't doing all that much. I mean, we could be doing a lot more and a lot more quickly to address climate change. And so my main conclusion is that the same conclusion I came to several years ago, that managed relocation is probably something we should have in our toolbox. I'm even more confident now that it's something we're going to need as we move forward, particularly if we want to keep some of the rare species we have today on the planet. So that's what I've got.
Thank you, Josh. There's much to chat about in what you just presented, which I look forward to doing here in a moment. And in the meantime, we're going to pass the mic to Aviv.
There we go. Okay, so thank you. I am coming to this topic more from the perspective of how we make decisions about managed relocation. I've been working on this topic for a number of years now and really focused on how we think about making these decisions and sort of where the barriers exist and what resources are available to us. So I just want to start by saying that making a decision in the face of uncertainty is difficult. This is probably one of the most obvious statements I can make, but I think it's really important to sort of highlight that that's where we're coming from when we think about managed relocation, because the outcomes are uncertain, the impacts are uncertain. We're thinking about doing something novel and innovative, but that shouldn't stop us from making a decision. And so making that decision is really one of the critical hurdles in implementing managed relocation. Go, no go, as we heard Josh speak about earlier. To what extent do we invest in this tool? And I want to highlight in the next couple of minutes a couple of barriers to decision making, and then resources that are actually available to us to help overcome some of these barriers and address them when we think about actually moving forward. Including risk aversion, uncertain levels of social acceptability, and then also questions around feasibility. So when we think about overcoming risk aversion, this is probably one of the biggest issues with managed relocation. People are uncertain about it. We saw snippets of some of the papers around the managed relocation debate, and should we do this? Should we not do this? And really, with risk aversion here, we're not thinking about this, as a whole. It's like in the context of a given decision, is this something that we want to pursue? And so overcoming that risk aversion really requires strategic thinking, systematic evaluation of risk, and finding a way to overcome that analysis paralysis, because at some point we have to make a decision in any given context. But it's also important to understand that risk and uncertainty is unavoidable. And we have to accept that when we're moving forward with any sort of innovative action regarding climate adaptation, we have to accept that we can't predict every novel interaction and outcome, and risk and uncertainty is a part of the equation here. So there's a couple of really great resources that can help us address risk in particular. In 2024, the National Invasive Species Council came out with this, considering the risk of managed relocation. And then in 2021, the National Park Service developed an ecological risk assessment. And both of these resources present what is really a laundry list of many different elements of risk associated with managed relocation, but they can be grouped into a couple of different categories. First is the risk of no action. So if we don't do anything, if we don't implement managed relocation, what is going to happen? What is the risk of threatened endangerment, extinction, et cetera, loss of ecosystem services? There are also many elements related to risks to the target species with this action, or target individuals. Will they survive the move? What will happen? Will they be able to persist in the new location? What will happen in terms of disease risk and genetic outcomes to those relocated individuals? And then one of the biggest categories that we think of, particularly with respect to risk aversion, is risk to the recipient ecosystem and species therein. So if we're moving something to a new location, what's going to happen to those species that are already there? Will there be negative competitive interactions, negative predation, spread of disease, et cetera? And so we can come up with a way to list all of these potential risks, but what is really important here with making a decision and moving forward is actually assessing that in a standardized way, and assessing it in a defensible manner. So I'm going to highlight this National Park Service risk assessment in particular, which provided some guidance on how to actually synthesize and evaluate that risk. And this is a summary table out of that report that provides guidance for every single risk that you can think of, and sort of how you might determine whether that risk is low, moderate, or high, and also provide some guidance to assess your confidence in that evaluation. And so when we're thinking about synthesizing our risk here, we're thinking about three elements. The first is the acceptability of overall risk. So overall, thinking about every single risk that you have evaluated, is this acceptable for moving forward? The second one to highlight is the acceptability of risk in a critical area. So perhaps overall, there's not a lot of high risks to this action, but maybe there's one or two that present a particular risk or a particular potential for negative outcome. And then the third is acceptability of the uncertainty in that risk. So how much confidence do you have in your assessment? And what's important with these three things that I want to highlight is the use of the word acceptability. Because as I mentioned before, we cannot avoid risk with managed relocation. We cannot avoid uncertainty. It's more about how much we're willing to accept that level of risk when we move forward with an action. The next barrier that I mentioned in the beginning is social acceptability. And what's really interesting about managed relocation in particular is we're talking about acceptability both by the public and practitioners. So as we've mentioned a couple times, the debate around the use of managed relocation as a tool has been going on for a long time, where some practitioners feel very strongly that this is the way to move forward. And in some cases, there's a little bit more uncertainty around that. And so we're sort of battling this acceptability on both fronts. thinking about both the public and then also the individuals who are needed to participate in implementing this action. And really, in order to pursue social acceptability, it's a process that requires transparency, accountability, and inclusive decision making. So another resource that I find is very helpful with this is a decision support framework that was developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2024 that outlines a potential process for going through the decision around, they're using the term conservation introductions, but what they're really thinking about here is managed relocation. And I want to highlight a couple of things about this decision support framework. The first is that managed relocation is one of several possible actions. So whenever you're making this decision around whether or not this is the appropriate tool or the appropriate strategy, you're thinking about this in the context of all of the potential actions you could take to save this species or population. Second, it highlights a lot of aspects or characteristics of a decision, of a transparent decision process that could really be applied to most conservation actions in general. But a process that is very structured. So it's something that can be clearly communicated. It's iterative. And in this case, when we think about doing feasibility assessments and risks assessments, you're able to go through this decision process again as you're collecting more information and you have more information to move forward. A decision process that's scalable, both to the extent of the introduction. So by that, I mean an experimental population and experimental relocation versus something that's a lot more widespread, thinking about moving an entire species. And then also scalable in terms of the geography. Are you moving it a couple 100 miles versus a couple 1,000 miles, within a single county, across multiple jurisdictions, et cetera. And then finally, a process that is collaborative. And really highlighting the importance of engagement with partners and all interested parties at the outset of these decisions. And this includes those with Wildlife Management Authority, land managers, scientists, cultural practitioners, local experts, the list goes on. But really, when we're thinking about managed relocation, the list is almost doubled because you're thinking about all of these experts, both who have a connection to the source ecosystem or source population, as well as those engaged in the management of the recipient ecosystem as well. And then the third barrier that I'll mention here is uncertainty around how we can make this action feasible. And I'll highlight just two elements of feasibility here. The first one is logistical. And in this case, when we're thinking about logistical feasibility, there's a lot of resources out there about translocations in general. People have been moving species and populations around for a very, very long time, both successfully and unsuccessfully, both with positive and negative outcomes. And we can really lean into the processes and the resources that are available and that we have learned from our experience moving other things around. But then we also have this question around regulatory feasibility. And this is something that is really a part of an active discourse right now with a lot of different agencies, but also with state agencies in particular. I'm currently with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, so I work a lot with state agencies. And so we're starting to talk a lot about regulatory feasibility here and thinking about, I'll just highlight a couple of questions that are still yet to be answered. So how do introduced species, how are they going to fit into formal state definitions for fish and wildlife? Are the species that we're moving considered native, non-native? At what point do they become naturalized? When we're really thinking about moving species into novel ecosystems, there's some questions remaining about that. And then also there's questions remaining about who has regulatory authority and what that formal process looks like, particularly if we're thinking about moving across state boundaries and across jurisdictions and how different agencies can work together to achieve this. So all of this is to say there are a lot of resources out there to help us make better decisions, more informed decisions, more transparent and defensible decisions. But that doesn't mean that the work is done. I think there's still a lot that we can contribute to this conversation. So thank you.
Great, Aviv. Thank you. That's terrific set of resources and very complimentary to Josh's presentation. Also, Just Fiaco, I'm looking at you. Is Robert here?
Robert, I don't know if he's here. If you are, please go on camera, but I don't see your name. One of our speakers had some travel scheduled for today, and I'm worried that it might have gone
Badly.
by. Oh, Typhoon Arai. Okay. Robert, sounds like he won't be joining us today. That is too bad, but we have two great speakers and a great moderator, so we're going to forge ahead.
Great. Okay. So what I think Robert would have offered is a little bit more experience or was going to share with us some species and discussions and conversations he's been part of in terms of managed relocation actually being put into practice. So though I think Aviv and Josh and I can talk about some of that as well. Just you're highlighting, is it possible to highlight Josh also?
I'm working on it.
Working on that? Okay.
There we go. I got it.
Perfect. Beautiful. Okay, that was really great. And as I say, I think we talked in advance before this webinar about what each of us might say, but I think you guys almost like you really coordinated. That was very complimentary. Thank you. And the purpose of having a moderated discussion is so that we can be in conversation with one another and move from our individual perspectives to kind of a shared dialogue. Because as Aviv, you just said in your last comments, there might be tools out there, but there's a lot of deliberation and decision making still to be done. And again, audience, several of you submitted questions in advance when you registered, and we have those integrated with the question list that I have in front of me. But if you have additional questions, thank you, Olivia, for that tag I just saw in chat. If you have additional questions, please pop them in the chat, and I will work them in, especially since we have a little bit more time because of Robert's typhoon. All right. I would like to ask both of you a big question that I think might make you a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm gonna come push you on it. You're not going to swear your life on the answer here, but I would like you to kind of keep an open mind and tell us what you really think. So both of you talked about managed relocation in practice, and I want to ask you a question about when. Like, when is the time to do it? You both discuss sort of dimensions of consideration, but if you're really trying to put managed relocation in practice, when do you evaluate all those dimensions and decide it might be time to either trial it or more fully implement it? Another way you could think about this question of when is like, what would need to be true in order for you to feel comfortable maybe recommending it or agreeing that a decision to move forward was appropriate? So you can either answer that as a when or as a what would need to be true for you from your point of view and your experience before you could say, yeah, that seems reasonable to move forward. That question makes sense? I also have my own answer to this question, and I have the unfair advantage of having thought of the question and the answer. So, but which one of you has thoughts you might want to share first?
I'm happy to say something.
Go for it, Josh.
And I think it has a lot to do with what Aviv was talking about. I think it's a weighing of risk, and I think as you're maybe looking at a population trajectory that's declining because of climate change, the risk of doing nothing increases, and there are other risks that potentially are increasing as well, or are decreasing. And so I think one has to weigh the risk of doing nothing against the risk of taking from a population that's too small. So you don't want
Mm-hmm.
to wait too long.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think those may be two of the biggest risks one has to weigh.
So
But I think
you're
it's some sort of
suggesting,
balance.
Josh, if I came to you and I said, I've got this dwindling source population and compelling evidence that inaction has high consequences, then those are the two dimensions where you say, okay, then I would take serious in consideration of moving forward.
Yeah, I'm thinking of trying to balance like you don't want to do it too soon because you may not need to do it, right? And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the risk of no action has to be great enough. And then you don't
Mm-hmm.
want to wait too long, because if you wait too long, the risk of it not going well or not succeeding becomes higher. And
So,
so I think there's some sort of sweet spot in the
okay.
middle, which is going to be different for every species and every situation and will be hard to find.
So when I say when, you say not too early and not too late.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. But figuring out what does too early look like and what does too late look like, and making sure that you're not acting in either of those domains. That's okay. That's good. That's helpful. Aviv, what do you think?
So I definitely agree with the not too early, not too late. You have to find the sweet spot. Um, I think ideally, before a species is listed.
Mm,
Um, so I mean, I don't want to open the can of worms of threatened and endangered status right
mhm,
now. But I think that there's a lot more flexibility with managing species uh, prior to listing. And oftentimes, once a species is actually listed, we're talking about a very dwindled population
mhm,
where we're losing the capacity to handle failures.
mhm,
Um, I would also, so this isn't exactly a when, but also sort of a what is in a perfect world, we could be thinking about starting these actions with species that are not going to be uh, hot touch points
mhm,
that might trigger really strong emotional
mhm,
reactions to
mhm,
success or failure. I think anytime you're doing something like this, it's going to feel experimental at first,
mhm,
um, and eliminating the concern, that risk of failure and the consequences of failure to the species, and then also to confidence in managers as a whole, I think
mhm,
is something that we need to consider.
mhm,
And then in terms of the too early, one of the characteristics that I would add to that is when we're thinking about projecting future potential ranges in the face of climate change is here. And so some of those areas may be suitable now or may be suitable in 5, 10 years, but
mhm.
what about in 50 years?
Yeah.
And so you kind of also have to weigh like, are we talking about tiny incremental movements?
Mhm,
Simplistically, let's say we're moving something north, tiny incremental movements or really big leaps. And so if we're doing it earlier, we might be tying ourselves a little bit more to those tiny incremental movements, which is more of a management investment.
mhm.
But it might be worth it in the long run if it gives us more flexibility to work with larger populations.
Yeah, I agree with you. We often talk about managed relocation like it's a do it, not do it thing, but it's not like there's one target location and it's a done deal. As the climate continues to change, there could potentially need a perpetual need for at least evaluating where the species is and where it should go. Um, that's really important. I think, but the benefit of being a moderator is I get to throw my own opinion in here too. I love the not too early, not too late framing. I think sometimes I, um, I think we have put a lot of evidence on, or a lot of emphasis on the risk mitigation, like what bad things could happen, and I think that's appropriate. But I also think that the timing is right when we know what we're doing and why we are doing it, and we're quite clear about that. So really defining what success looks like. And the reason why I think that is so important is because we are also, the time will be right for managed relocation when we make a compelling case for it, which is partially about risk and about evaluating that risk, but also about what we're trying to do, the likelihood of success. And success, I also think, is more likely to drive incentives for land managers and agencies to actually implement. I think the risk framing places managers in a tricky situation where the possibility of doing some harm greatly outweighs a more vague notion of doing something positive. And the more we can be clear about what the objective is, the more we can evaluate it against the risk. So are we trying to save a species from extinction? Are we trying to increase timber yields? Are we trying to explore the possibility of introducing a beloved organism into a new location where it has recreational benefits, right? There can be highly nuanced and very location-specific reasons or definitions of success. And I think it would be compelling for us to spend more time talking about what we're trying to accomplish in addition to what we're trying to avoid. So I would throw that into the when the case is compelling. I also think, Aviv, in addition to your like safe cases, I think about a lot of instances like where we could back out or undo, where we say, oops, that was a risk we didn't think of. And so I can think of a lot of sort of taxonomic groups where it would be really hard to put the genie back in the bottle. Introducing species into nature probably is always a thing that's hard to undo, but there might be some cases where it's more like possible to do that than not. And then, Josh, you talked about opportunity costs. I think we undersell opportunity costs. So in addition to success, I think like, what else could we be doing? And is there something better or cheaper or more viable? And so I want to know that we've thought about that too. Anything else you want to add on this point about when or when you'd feel comfortable recommending? Okay. So this is kind of a related question. I'm curious what you think, and Aviv, you mentioned this already, like species will need to go to new locations. Well, maybe they'll go to one location in 10 years and another location 20 years after that, another location. So what do you think about the quality of our science to be making targeting recommendations? So where should this species go? What do we have? Are our models good enough? How could, if those models involved uncertainty, how could we sort of embrace that uncertainty in the location decision making? Or are there certain science questions we should be pursuing in improving our models? Aviv, what do you think about modeling?
The big question at the end. I think the science that we have to back that is pretty good. It could always be better. But I think it's at a point where we have enough information that we can make decisions. They might not be perfect, but I think there's enough information out there that we can move forward with decisions. But there's also this other layer with that where we can have it. Let's say we had the perfect model that told us exactly where we should put a species. We still need to make sure that we could. Is it an area that's protected? Is it likely to be impacted by development in the future? What does connectivity look like? And so I think when you start layering on some of those other issues, as well as sort of where the opportunities exist to place species, I think some of that really makes up for where we might not have the perfect model. Because that's, we're working within the confines of our realistic landscape now. And so I think that that's where sort of any missing links in some of our modeling might match up with that. But I also, I am not a modeler. And so I definitely would love to hear Josh's thoughts on this question as well.
Hey, Josh, you just punted to you.
Yep. Um, I agree with what Aviva said. I think the models can tell us something. I think they're useful. I think we want to be careful because they're uncertain. And I think some things we can do, like Aviv said, there are other things we need to consider after we have a model projection that we might want to use. I think this speaks to the previous question. Like, if we start with a large enough population and when things aren't really on the edge, then we have multiple options and we can do this whole experiment more as an experiment, as not as a last ditch effort, not as a moonshot. And so in that case, one might have more flexibility and the model uncertainty might have less of an impact on the outcome. So I think that's important. Um, the other thing is, I think, at least some of the examples I've seen of recent movements of species, they've been close by. They haven't been aiming for thousands of kilometers to the north or wherever some species distribution model has projected, but they've been one watershed away or above a dam or the next island over. So we can take shorter steps, I think. And maybe as we get better at this, taking a short step and then another short step and another short step isn't such a big deal or will become less of a big deal than trying one shot for something a model predicts way out in the future or far away. So I think those are two things to consider to address model uncertainty because there'll always be model uncertainty.
There will always be model uncertainty. One of the things that kind of has always made me nervous about our range shift models, which I think are good on the surface and are well justified biologically and ecologically, right? They're based on good principles. But I think sometimes the more particular we make them, the more we almost fool ourselves into thinking that they're making specific geographic recommendations, right? So I almost want us to make our models better, but squint our eyes more when we look at them. I think people are often invited to say, oh, look, that little pixel right there is colored in, therefore that's a meaningful prediction. And it may never really be, we may never really have models that enable us to do that kind of pixel picking. And so this perfect model is a misnomer, while at the same time we can be improving our models. I don't know, have you guys been watching this literature? A couple of months ago, I was looking at a paper, I think it came out of Dov Sachs's lab, where they were looking at species historic responses to climate change using things like tree rings and asking whether a model prediction does a good job or not. I think efforts to sort of qualitatively evaluate our models, there's a lot of research potential there that we could still be doing that's pretty interesting. I mean, Josh, what do you think about the literature right now on model development?
Well, I think the species distribution models have come a long way. Um, I think folks are starting to use other more mechanistic models more often.
Mm,
They're data hungry, and so that's always been a challenge.
yeah.
But building them is easier now,
Hmm.
and there's more data than there was 20 years ago.
Hmm.
So I think folks are starting to use better models, but they're still going to be uncertain, even if they're more mechanistic. There's still going to be challenges with using them. Um, so I think the field has advanced, and that's great. Um, but we'll still have the same concerns. Maybe we'll have better models, but we'll still have the same concerns.
Okay, so I want to ask a follow-up on that. If we have the same, so you're a University of Washington professor, I'm a University of Minnesota professor. We've pontificated about, Aviv, you live closer to practice than we do. Josh and I have been pontificating about managed relocation for a long time. I have the benefit of still living in pontification space. Like my name isn't on the order of do it. But Aviv, you are also largely in that kind of science evaluative space. What role do you think that scientists or those of us who are sort of sitting around thinking about this, what role should we be playing in that go, no go, use this model, that kind of practical decision making? Aviv, what are you comfortable with? Maybe it's how people might use some of the tools that you were talking about. What if those are translated into real decisions? How do you feel that is about that as a tool developer?
Um, I mean, I think like I almost want to make a bigger statement about the the role of scientists in these decisions more
Please.
is that um there's a level of comfort that you get being able to sit back and say, I just researched this. I'm not a decision maker. Um, it also never fails to amaze me how many times you talk to a practitioner who works in an agency or an NGO who also asserts that they are not the decision maker. Everybody is making decisions. Maybe your name isn't on like the final signatory, but everybody is making decisions. And I would like to see researchers come out of their comfort zone a little bit more in terms of advocating for decisions. Now, I'm not saying that's like yes to manage relocation in every context in every species. There are still some contexts where I'm like, what if we should be doing this?
Yeah, there's a decision not to do something.
Yeah. But I think that we're faced with really, really big challenges when it comes to climate adaptation and the threats of climate change and biodiversity loss. And I would like to see scientists become more comfortable and also have the what is it called, social license, um, to be able to advocate for decisions um, without losing their stance as a relatively objective scientist. I think it's okay to care a lot about conservation and be like, this is a good thing to do. This is an action that we need to take while still being able to conduct research and be objective about their research, but being able to more clearly communicate this is how the research can be used, and I feel comfortable advocating for this decision.
Aviv, that reminds me, one of the things I was taught by a mentor of mine who's now deceased, Steve Schneider, a climate scientist. He said he felt that scientists are not objective, and they shouldn't be, because they are human beings and they care about their research subjects and very knowledgeable, they shouldn't be asked to step away from decisions. But the duty of a scientist is always to show your cards. This is why I think what I think. This is how I know what I know. Here are my uncertainties, and to be abundantly transparent about including abundantly transparent about when there might be certain value systems that are in play that are not empirical, or they still might be measurable or explorable and therefore scientific, but just to always think about showing your cards.
Yeah.
That has always influenced my thinking. Josh, what do you think?
Ooh, I agree with all that. And I think that's something that scientists can be comfortable with, like because that's what we're trained to do, right? We're trained to do the research and then to explain it and to reveal it all, right? You don't hide any of it. You don't leave anything out. Of course, you have to leave some stuff out because it won't fit in the paper, but you don't selectively leave out things. Um, so yeah, I think that's great advice, and yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, great. So actually, can you both tell me, in addition to being on webinars like this, to what degree have you interacted both with the public on this idea and sat down with particular species or with real management decisions? Talk to me about your experience with direct engagement in practice.
That's a good question. I'll go first because it's probably a little bit more minimal. So most of my engagement hasn't been with the quote unquote general public. It would have been with sort of managers in different agencies and NGOs. And I would say my engagement has more been helping to communicate about what risk is, how we can think about it, and providing tools to help individuals communicate about risk. I haven't been engaged. It would have been great if Robert Fisher could have been here because he could have talked about actually implementing a managed relocation, and he's worked a lot with Guam Kingfisher and others. But
Yeah.
so I think most of my engagement has been not necessarily within the context of a particular case study, but more talking with folks who are considering implementing managed relocation or who have implemented it.
At a kind of agency level, like the Park
Yeah.
Service, for example.
Yeah. Mhm.
It's real, but it's still sort of like an idea in realness.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like once removed. So not the person working to move the species or population, but communicating with somebody who does work with.
Great. Josh, how about you?
I don't have any specific managed relocation examples. I have an example that gets at what you were just talking about, though. That was some modeling we'd done a long time ago, and I got a call from somebody from some environmental organization who asked if we had a model for the northern flying squirrel and what it projected, and could we share that? And we did, and then I walked them through what was in the model, what it did and what it didn't do, how you interpret the data, went through all that, and they asked if they could rebuild the model, gave them data, gave them all sorts of stuff. So, like you said, I laid everything on the table. And then about a month later, I got a call from somebody from the Fish and Wildlife Service who said, "We're going to be sued about the northern flying squirrel, and can you tell me about your model?" And so I just went through the exact same thing all over again in the exact same way. And I felt like, okay, I think I did that right. Like I gave everybody all the information I had and gave them all the caveats and warnings and how to interpret what it meant. So that's one example.
Yeah, on the showing your cards, Josh, an additional caveat is you're supposed to show your cards to anyone who wants to see them.
Right.
I mean, there can be people who maybe don't have anyone with goodwill who maybe wants to see them, but yeah. I'll just add, I do think that I've been advocating lately that we really do need to be talking to the public about adaptation in general, because we can make range models, we can make decision tools, we can talk about institutional barriers and all of the intellectual and regulatory impediments to manage relocation. But in the end, it is a human action for a human problem to yield human desires and outcomes. And I sometimes worry that a lot of natural resource adaptation decisions live in expert land, whether those experts are scientists and university professors, or those experts are state agency personnel. But when we talk about what is defining success and what do we want and what are we trying to achieve, that's also a public good. So I think the interesting thing about managed relocation also is that it's provocative enough to maybe engage the imagination of the public and to help them think about what is the future that we might be trying to create or to preserve. That's my take on. That's why I like to talk to regular people about managed relocation too. Okay, I have one closing question, and we're going to end a little bit early because Robert wasn't here, but I pinged the chat if folks had things they wanted to say, and I've got 2 questions and a comment that we can talk about. So Seth asks, how well do you think we actually understand the causal factors driving a decline in species that might be considered for relocation? Okay, so this is like we can make the map of they lived here and they might go there, but how do we know that climate is the actual driver and therefore we're overcoming a limitation on that species? that's not only a risk assessment, like does this species or what genotype need it, but it's also a likelihood of success because we've actually alleviated a limiting factor. What would the two of you say about this question? How well do you think we actually understand when climate is a, or geography is a limiting component to a species thriving? Either one of you.
I'm trying to come up with a good example, so I'm kind of hesitant to respond without a good example. But for a lot of the stories I've heard recently about the movement of species, they had a really good idea of what the limiting factor was and why the species could not exist any longer where it was. And they were climate related. So I think, at least for the examples, the stories I've heard, there is a clear link. So the people that are thinking about it and doing the movement really have good evidence. When we're talking about doing it further in advance, when there's
Right.
maybe less
Hard to
risk
know.
and
Yeah.
before, then I think it becomes fuzzier and maybe harder to figure out exactly how much of the population decline is climate change and what is the exact factor that one needs to avoid. Yeah.
Aviv?
That was a great response. I think what I would add is that most of the examples, it's probably not just climate change. Like it's climate change and habitat destruction. It's climate change and invasive species. And so I think that like when we're thinking about taking these actions, those threats can also be very pressing. And so if there's not sort of perfect understanding about the impacts of climate change, it doesn't necessarily mean that this action is still not appropriate.
Very interesting. Okay, Christina, example of managed relocation, too soon or too late. I'm not sure that we can answer that because I don't know that we have a big enough sort of book of practice to say this was done too early and this was done too late. But I would like to address your other comment. You said suggestions for getting the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on board with managed relocation. Personally, I'm not going to comment on whether they are or are not on board, but I will say something from my own experience working with recovery teams is that managed relocation, in my experience, does frequently come up in discussions about possible species recovery. And this is speaking from personal experience, mostly. I sense a nervousness, however, like the recovery team needs to exist to inform how recovery should proceed. But I don't know that anyone is really going to be congratulated or celebrated or promoted for being the managed relocation implementer. And I think those processes may be set up to be pretty conservative by nature, meaning we can have the team and we can write reports, but I don't really know what is the institutional trigger that encourages that team or a member of that team to say, you know what, I'm going to be the one who thinks, that's going to implement this managed relocation, or I think we should do that. I don't know what those policies or protocols need to be. That's just my own personal experience where we're all sort of looking around the table, who's going to make this happen. I think that kind of institutional incentive. Are you going to be more successful talking about, but not acting, professionally successful, or more, which is the path of least resistance? I don't know that our approaches to conservation have paved the path to implementation of managed relocation particularly successfully. Aviv, Josh, you're nodding your head. I'm not saying this very clearly, but you seem to get a little bit of what I'm suggesting. What would you add?
I would add, I feel like I want to make a disclaimer. I am not an employee of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I cannot speak for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife
Me neither.
Service.
I don't know.
I cannot speak for the
I'm not
colleagues,
responsible
for my
for that.
colleagues
And they're
who are
amazing.
Fish and Wildlife Service employees. But at least the Pacific region, developed a decision framework for this action, specifically because they recognized that it is starting to enter the conversation and they need to be prepared to make those decisions. So I don't know if there's ever going to be agency wide like stamp of approval. Yes, we're going to do this. Let's go all in. But there is a recognition that these discussions are going to happen and that they need to be able to know how to make a decision. And it might also vary regionally. So that decision support framework for the Pacific region, we engaged partners both in the Pacific Islands and the Pacific Northwest. And I mean, there was a little microcosm of a social experiment between how folks who work in the Pacific Islands were discussing managed relocation versus the Pacific Northwest. So where threats of climate change were far more pressing and immediate, and here there was a lot more, I would say, like overall support for implementing managed relocation in the Pacific Islands. Whereas in the Pacific Northwest, it was a little bit more of, oh, I could see how this might be useful eventually. Yeah, we need to be able to make these decisions. And so I think also when we think about agency support, there's probably also going to be some regional differences as well.
Yeah,
Personal
sure.
opinion, not spokesperson of an agency.
Josh, want to add anything?
Sure, yeah, I'll add something to something you said about the individual who's going to head up the team or the team that's going to do the managed relocation. And I think we probably in general need to be more comfortable with failing
Yeah.
and we're not going to get it right every time. And so making sure that the team or the lead isn't punished for not getting it right. Um, and I don't know, I don't even know about culture within any agency, much less Fish and Wildlife Service. So I don't know if that's a problem or not. Um, but making sure that it doesn't come back to haunt whoever's doing it, to taking some of that risk away. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Josh, you basically just gave a little promo opportunity for me to promote a paper that we just published. I think it came out yesterday. And this is a group of Midwest CAS postdocs and myself, we'd say we need to talk about maladaptation, that we need to have explicit conversation about what is it that we're afraid of messing up. That not being conscientious about talking about mistakes. What are mistakes? Who's going to make mistakes? What is a culture that enables or advances the concept of mistakes? Without that, we're going to still struggle to wrap our head around what we're afraid of and what mistakes look like. So that paper's called "We Need to Talk About Maladaptation, Published in Climatic Change Now." And I just put a link in. Okay, so my last question, I'll reference Anna says, talk to extension in your state is very knowledgeable about public engagement. I think it's a terrific. This is certainly true in our U of M extension. I know that the University of Minnesota is working on a variety of adaptation specific sort of extension materials for forestry and other natural resource spaces. And that is a very powerful resource and a place where science gets put into action. And then my very last question for both of you is, Josh, you talked about 15 or 20 years ago, it's impossible that you and I could be that old, or that this topic could be talked about for that long, but it is true. So let's roll the clock forward another 5 years or maybe even 10 years. What do you think will be going on? What we'll be talking about, or where will we be in this will we still be early adopters? What do you see for managed relocation in the science or decision-making support associated with managed relocation over the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
If I were to be really optimistic, which I tend not to be at all, but if I were to be really optimistic, I would say that we're thinking more like Aviv was in the answer to your first question. We're thinking ahead and we're understanding the impacts of climate change and we're preparing species for climate change before they need to be listed.
Less
Uh,
reactionary. Yeah.
yeah, we're being proactive and we've got a lot of the adaptation figured out. Like if I were to be optimistic, I think we'd be there in 15, 20 years. Yeah.
You got a lot of work to do.
Yep.
Aviv, what do you think?
Um, I'll try to be optimistic. I had a conversation with somebody recently that we were saying that in order to work in this field, whether you admit it or not, you are an optimist and you are
Yeah.
hopeful because otherwise,
Yeah.
how would you get out of bed every day and do this work?
Mm.
But I think um, in 5, 10 years, I would like to see some more implementation of managed relocation, and where we can find those case studies. I feel like something that we've all said is this is happening, but it's happening kind of quietly. It's not, there's not a lot of very published case studies, both successful and unsuccessful. And I think in order
Yeah.
to move this forward, we really need to start hearing about them, which is scary, especially if something does not have a like fully successful outcome. It can be really scary
Yeah.
to talk about it.
Yeah.
But I think uh, we would have, be figuring that out. And I'd like to see more support for some of the sort of more directed adaptation. I'm thinking like the RAD framework, resist,
Yeah.
direct, and I think in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we're going to see a little bit more direction, and shifting how we think about the field of conservation and accepting that we're going to have to direct more change if we want to conserve not necessarily like this particular ecosystem function or this particular species, but if we want to conserve nature and biodiversity generally in the way that we have interacted with it, I think that we're going to have to be more proactive in directing change.
Okay, I think that's a great last sentiment, and I think we can wrap things up here. We're accounting for the 10 minutes that Robert would have presented. I guess I would like to add just one final reflection, which I really hope came across in our discussion today, is we talked about science, you guys talked about tools and models, and yet every time we also come back around to decision making as where science is pertinent and really, really critical, but it's a component of that decision. So we need to make the science better, but we also need to build the conditions necessary to act on that science. So a lot of adaptation and a lot of innovation adaptation really is about how we make decisions, which is a collection of scientific and social and cultural and values decisions. So much work to do. I'm grateful, Aviv and Josh, that you would spend time with us today. And thank you, everyone, for staying on and listening to this dialogue. I invite everyone to have a look at the chat window. There's some really rich conversation there, and observations. And I think this is just the beginning of how the Midwest Cast and other science-based entities can continue to advance the managed relocation conversation. I'm going to turn it back to Jess Delfiaco, who's going to ask folks to respond to a quick assessment. And it was a pleasure being with all of you. And take care. Jess.
Yeah, just to reiterate, thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you, Jessica, for moderating and for the really thoughtful questions and comments that have been coming through in the chat. We appreciate you all. Just got a quick question to ask kind of what you are taking away with you today, if this was a valuable experience to join us for this webinar discussion, and then if there's any other innovation and adaptation topics that you would be excited to talk about in future events, we would love to hear them. So thank you again. We'll be in touch in the next week or so to share the recording of this, as well as the resources that we shared and that were shared in presentations in the chat. And then we'll also invite Robert to share anything that he might might have shared on in the discussion today in that follow-up email. So keep an eye out for that.
Thanks, everyone.